Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our introduction to CSS or cascading style sheets. Specifically in this video, we are going to take a look at how we can push our styling out to a separate file so that we can completely separate the idea of the data or the model from the presentation or the view. In other words, basically we can keep all of the styling and all the aesthetics in one file and all the data, the metadata and the structure in another. And by that, we mean keeping the style in the CSS file and the metadata and the data in the HTML file. Now, this video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and the other technologies related to intranet and internet development. It also assumes that you've watched some of the earlier videos, for instance, on the HTML tag and some basic style sheet knowledge. So to begin with, you'll take a look at the page that I have up for us, and that is the HTML link tag. And the idea is that we're going to put that link tag in the head of our HTML document, and we're going to use it to reference a style sheet. Now we're going to be creating both the HTML document and the style document in this video. So this video is going to probably take us a little longer than some of the earlier videos. You probably also want to have your CSS properties reference page up. Again, we're going to stick with some pretty simple examples, but that way you can see all of the possibilities, and also you want to refresh yourself briefly on the selectors because we will be taking advantage of those. And so the first thing that we want to do is I'm going to go over to Visual Studio, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new HTML page. And this I'm going to name CSS. And we're going to call this one separate document, or I tell you what, why don't we just call this external document, because that probably makes the most sense here. So we're going to call this external document. And just like before, I'm going to go ahead and add my H1 tag here. Go ahead and split our view. And then let's go ahead and save it. And so this is going to be our CSS external document. And then the next thing that we want to do is to go ahead and create a new CSS file or a new style sheet. So again, depending on what IDE that you're using, this might come up a little bit different. So basically what you're looking for is the cascading style sheet. And you'll notice that right off the bat, it populates it with the body tag. Now, it turns out we do not necessarily have to use this. We are going to use this. We're going to have some fun with it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be bouncing back and forth between these two examples here, this HTML example and this style sheet here. And so what we need to do is we first need to come up with a good name for this style sheet. And to go ahead and set us up for some examples in the future, we're going to go ahead and call this one sample shared. I want to go ahead and imply right off the bat that this CSS can be shared with multiple HTML documents. Now, this one's going to be probably such a big mess by the time we're done with it that we're not really going to want to use it. But again, we want to get into the habit of thinking about this as a shared style sheet. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and save this, and we'll simply just call it sample underscore shared. And you want to take special care to note where you are putting this file. And so you should see, if you've got your file system set up correctly, you should see a bunch of examples now all in one folder. And you can see the examples from the previous video, and then you can also see my sample shared.css. Now, I'm not going to bother to have Explorer up. I trust that you can do that now yourself. But the idea then is that I should be able to reference this document, or rather that style sheet, in my HTML document. And to do that, I simply specify the link tag. I specify the relationship, and the relationship is going to be style sheet. And then we also want to specify the path to it. And it turns out it doesn't even have to be on your local machine. You could actually use a style sheet that's hosted on a different web server, another resource. You can use relative paths. But again, we've kept this one simple in that it will actually be in the same folder. And you should now see your sample shared.css. So basically, if you keep your HTML and your style sheets in the same folder for right now, that's probably okay. Long term, you would probably consider separating them so that you can have a more structured website. But in this case, we're going to stick with our sample shared.css being in the same folder as our HTML. And we need to know that we've actually accomplished something here. And the easiest way to do this, I'm going to go ahead and split my screen. Can here, I'm going to go ahead and split my screen. Does not seem to want to let me do that. Let's see if I can get it to do it. Been having some rather interesting behavior with Visual Studio lately. I have to see if there's a new update here. So we won't worry about splitting the screen right now. But what we do want to do is we want to show that we've actually accomplished something. And the easiest thing to do is to go ahead and modify, for instance, the background color of the body. And we did this in the earlier video. Again, have some fun with it. Let's see if we can come up with a color that's not too hard on us. And let's see here. How about if we go with corn silk? I have no idea what corn silk looks like. We're about to find out. And then let's see if we can refresh this. Now, we're just going to give up on the built-in viewer here, and we're just going to split the screen. We'll just bounce back and forth with our web page, or excuse me, our web client. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the page. And so there is our CSS, our external document. Now let me make sure I have, in fact, saved these. And so there we go, and save this one. I'm going to refresh this one more time, and you can see, hopefully I've picked a color that you can see through the video. If not, I apologize. It's basically this parchment style color. It's hopefully going to be pretty easy on our eyes, especially when we start picking some other crazier colors. And while we're at it, why don't we go ahead and change the color for the external document, in other words, our title here, so our H1. And so what you can do is you can come back through here, and just to get started now, what we can do is we can specify our H1 tag. And what would we like to do here? How about if we do we'll leave the font size alone. We'll just mess with the color for this one. And how about if we go with a nice red? I think that's what we're going to pick for both our H1s and our H2s for this example. And again, there we go. Now we've got our color red. And if I refresh this, you could see that it clearly is working, because now my H1 is red. Now, what I want to do is I just want to quickly go through some examples here to make sure that we really understand the power of this and how we can go about doing this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a couple of P tags here, just with some sample text, nothing too complicated, sample text 1, 2, 3, and we'll see if we need some more. And the idea then is just so you can see how you would go back and forth between manipulating the HTML and editing the style sheet in a separate document. And so again, as a quick reminder of how you would go about doing this. So the first thing that you could do is you could leverage the ID. And so in this case, we're going to call this one paragraph 1. We're going to call this one paragraph 2. This is going to be paragraph 3, and so on. And then we can go ahead and give it a class as well. So class, how about if we just call this one info? Same with the second one. And for the third one, what we're going to do is we're going to make this one, again, a warning, a little bit of a variety. So you can see here that we have got 3 paragraphs, but they differ in their class and their ID, or two of them have the same class. And so what we'd like to do is we'd like to figure out a couple of different ways, or how we would go about then modifying the font color, the font size, and so on, some of the other behavior associated with these. Now, we saw from the previous video that one option would be to leverage our IDs. And so we would do para 1, para 2, and para 3. And yes, that could work. As a matter of fact, we'll go ahead and leverage the font size. And let's go ahead and change that to 20. We're not going to make it that large, but we're going to make it so that it's noticeable. Go ahead and save your HTML. Come back over here to your web browser and refresh this, and you'll notice probably should have left one of the texts original. Tell you what, why don't we just go ahead and add a fourth one in here? That way we've got it as a reference text. I'm not even going to bother to give it an ID or a class. I'm just going to say sample text number 4, and this is just as a reference so that we can see that our changes are actually going through. If we come over here and we refresh that, you can clearly see that sample text number 4 is slightly smaller than the other ones. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. We'll see if we have to scroll up and down too much. We'll zoom back out, but there you go. Okay. Now, that is clearly one way of going about doing this. However, you would agree that that is not very efficient and also not very extendable, meaning that why would we go through and create a shared CSS file if we were just going to do nothing more than hard code IDs in there? So in other words, that's probably not going to make a whole lot of sense. Now, what we can do is we can, in fact, come along and again use that wildcard approach so that we're changing the font size for all of the paragraphs that have the ID starting with para_03. We can also just simply leverage the fact that these are all p tags. And so what we could do there is we could just simply say font size. And again, we'll make this one 20 pixels. And you'll see that there's a problem with this approach as well, because now when I refresh this, all 4 of them are in fact the same size. So basically, we don't really seem to be getting much from doing it this way. In other words, we're not getting the granularity or we're overcomplicating it. And so instead, what we'd like to do is, again, use that selector approach that we saw earlier in the CSS selectors. I'll take us back over there just so we can see it, where we can specify a particular attribute and where it matches a particular substring. That's one way to go about doing it. And so what we can do then is we can say ID asterisk equals, and in this case, then we'll just say para. And if that matches, then we change the font size to 20. Now I am going to go ahead and get rid of these. We can come back through and put them in as comments later on. But now when I refresh this page, you can see that the 4th text now goes back to its regular size. All 4 of them are in fact still the default color. That'll be our next thing to change. And so what we can do here is we can come along now and we can specify based on a class name. So in this case, it's going to be info. Maybe for information, we simply want the color to be green. In other words, indicate that there's no problem. And then for a warning, then we would specify that the color needs to be yellow or something along those lines. In other words, basically indicative of there being a problem. And now when we come along here, you'll notice that the first 2 are green. That's still pretty hard to read, so I think I'm going to change this. And this has been left alone because it doesn't match any of the filters that we currently have. And before we get too far in this, let's actually come up with a different color here. I'm going to go with brown. And let's see if make sure that that is a little bit easier to read. And sure enough, it is. All right. So now hopefully you can see with some tweaking here, we've got the ability now to style based on a class, based on an ID, potentially based on a tag or a group of tags. Okay. And so what we can do now is we can come along and we'll add that same table that we've been doing now for multiple examples. But this time around, we want to add it sort of with a more longer term purpose with this style sheet. And so what we want to do is we want to think about making the style sheet more persistent, making it something that can be used over multiple pages. And so what would we want this style to look like? So the first thing we want to do is we want to think a little bit about the structure of the HTML. And I think we got that pretty much right the last time. So we specified the table. However, though, we did specify the ID of the table. And instead of doing that, I'm just going to specify this as being sample, and I'm going to specify the class of the table to be alternating. Now, what I want to do is I want to come in here and I want to add my TR and my TDs. And so there is going to be row number 1. And then we're going to stop with 4 again. There's going to be 2, 3, and 4. And then much like before, we can go ahead and add an ID to each one of the cells. We can also add an ID to each one of the rows. But what we're interested in more is the alternating color patterns. So this is where we want to specify a class. And then for the second and fourth rather, class even. And I think I put that in the wrong spot. Let's try that one more time. There we go. And so the only thing then that we need to do is to somehow figure out how we are going to make sure that both the table and the cells get a border. And again, I'm going to do this one just a little bit different than I did in the previous example. And so what we'll do is we'll mix this up just a little bit here. We're going to have table, and TD is going to be specifying the border. And then what we'll do is instead of using the ID, we'll use the class name. So in this case, odd and even. And again, we're just going to use the background color as the best example. Again, we'll stick with the aqua and the aquamarine. All right, so we made a lot of changes. Let's go back over to our web browser and let's see exactly what this looks like. I did not save my HTML file, so let's save that. Let's try this again, and you can see now that we have nice variations here between the colors. I could probably make it a little more contrasting for anyone that has difficulty seeing the greens. So I tell you what, why don't we at least go in here and change one of these to something a little bit more obvious. So we've already used brown, we've used red. Let's see what we can come up with here that would be a little bit easier to see. Hopefully you could see that pretty easily. And you notice I'm only saving the CSS file because it gets reloaded every time I hit refresh. And by the way, when you see those changes right there, that means I've just hit F5 on my keyboard. Now, again, I don't want you to lose sight of the purpose behind this video or the previous videos that were focusing on this introduction to style. This is by no means the end all and be all about style sheets. Instead, what we were doing is we were focusing on where to put the style. And the key thing to note with this particular example is that we push all of the style over to a separate file, separate .css file, and we simply link it in the head of the document using the style sheet value for the rel attribute and the relative path to the .css file. You can also use absolute paths if you want to. That's perfectly fine, but I'm going to encourage you to use relative paths. In this case, the CSS file sits in the .html file, so there's no, in the same folder as the .html file, so there are no issues there. And again, encourage you to play around with a combination of IDs and classes so that you get familiar with these selectors. Use other elements. In this series of videos, I have not focused at all on images, for instance. I've kept it simple with just paragraphs and tables, but I encourage you to go back and just try this with all of the other elements that you've already worked with. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thank you for watching.